Harappan, or Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished across what is now Pakistan and northwest India from about 3000 BC, but was abandoned in 1800 BC, according to some due to a terrible atomic war. The Indus Valley was thought to be the earliest civilization in the area, but over recent years, discoveries have been made which indicate the existence of a civilization on the Arabian Sea coast of India as far back as 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. Some fringe researchers even believe that pre-Ice Age structures and artifacts from a lost civilization await discovery on the seabed in the area. The remains of one of the world's first great cities, Mohenjo-Daro, lie on the bank of the Indus River in the Sindh province of southern Pakistan. It was one of the major urban centers of the Indus Valley Civilization, which originated about 3300 BC in the Indus and Ganga-Hakra river valleys in what is now Pakistan and western India. Around 1,000 towns and settlement sites of the Indus civilization have so far been discovered, with the main sites being the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, located 400 miles north of Mohenjo-Daro, and the coastal site of Lothal. Traces of the Indus civilization have been discovered as far north as the Himalayas and northern Afghanistan, and as far south as Mumbai, Bombay. During its peak period between 2600 and 1900 BC, it has been estimated that the Indus civilization may have had a population of as much as 5 million. Located on the lower Indus, surrounded by a fertile floodplain, Mohenjo-Daro must have been an extremely prosperous city, controlling the trade routes based on the river network. Signs of change at Mohenjo-Daro began to appear in the material culture of the city after 1900 BC, and within 100 years, Mohenjo-Daro was abandoned as the Indus Valley Civilization declined. Some bizarre claims have been made surrounding the supposed destruction of Mohenjo-Daro. Without doubt, the most extreme theory is that it and other cities of the Indus civilization were destroyed by ancient atomic warfare. Cited as evidence for this, artifacts from the skeletons found at the ancient city were highly radioactive, comparable with those from Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and that many of these skeletons were sprawled in the street, some holding hands, as if some instant horrible doom had taken place. The supposed discovery of a heavy layer of radioactive ash in Rajasthan, India, which covers a 3-square-mile area, is also given in the support of the claims of ancient atomic warfare. In his 1970 book, Gods from Outer Space, Eric von Daniken says that the old Indian and Tibetan texts in particular teem with science fiction weapons. I am thinking of the divine lightning and ray weapons, and of the texts that seem to be referring to bacteriological weapons. Another source which probably added to the myth is the Vaimanika Shastra, Science of Aeronautics, which first appeared in English in 1973, translated by G.R. Joshier. This supposedly ancient Sanskrit text discusses the construction of vimanas, mythical self-propelled aerial vehicles described in the Sanskrit epics. Recent research into this text has, however, shown that the manuscript was actually written sometime between 1918 and 1922, though this has not prevented it having a significant influence on proponents of the theory that vimanas were real ancient flying machines, probably used for ancient aerial warfare. From here it is but a short step to ancient nuclear destruction. Many of the structures at Mohenjo-Daro were constructed of fired bricks, and it is partly for this reason that the site is one of the best preserved ancient cities in the world. In fact, the walls of some of the structures still stand 10 feet or more high, pretty impressive after a nuclear destruction. For decades, archaeologists have argued about the origins of the Indus Valley Civilization. In 2001, new findings by Indian scientists from the National Institute of Ocean Technology working in the Gulf of Cambay suggest that the Harappans were descended from an advanced mother culture that flourished at the end of the last ice age, that was then submerged by rising sea levels before history began. In 2001, the remains of a huge lost city were located 118 feet underwater in the Gulf of Cambay off the western coast of India. A year later, further acoustic imaging surveys were undertaken and evidence recorded for human settlement at the site, which included the foundations of huge structures, pottery, sections of walls, beads, pieces of sculpture, and human bone. One of the wooden finds from the city has given a radiocarbon date of 7500 BC, which would make the site 4000 earlier than the oldest known civilization in India. Research is ongoing at this fascinating site, which, if the dates are proved correct, may one day radically alter our understanding of the world's first civilizations. Researcher Graham Hancock, author of the 2002 book Underworld: Flooded Kingdoms of the Ice Age, believes such discoveries vindicate his long-held beliefs about the existence of highly advanced civilizations throughout the world in prehistoric times and their obliteration from the historical record by a huge catastrophe over 10,000 years ago. Hancock commented on how the discoveries in the Gulf of Cambay fitted in nicely with his theories. In India, new evidence from the bottom of the sea is showing substance to the myth. This in the Gulf of Cambay in northwest India. In late 2001, scientists conducting pollution studies made an astonishing accidental discovery. 25 miles from shore, at a depth of 120 feet, they picked up traces of an ancient city covering a large area of the seabed. The discovery threatened to overturn everything that archaeologists believed about the origins of civilization. They found a city the size of Manhattan with massive walls and plazas, and man-made objects from the submerged cities have yielded carbon dates up to 9,500 years old. That's 5,000 years older than any city discovered by archaeologists anywhere. It means we are dealing with a civilization lost at the end of the Ice Age, perhaps even one of those that the flood myths speak of, which flourished before history began. The conclusion drawn by the geologists who found the site was that the remains constituted a prehistoric civilization that was the forerunner and model to the subsequent advanced Harappan civilization known to history. They believed that the prehistoric metropolis of Cambay was in existence from about 13,000 BC to around 3000 BC, making it the most ancient and largest city civilization not only in Asia but also the entire world. For them, it's at least 7,500 years older than the oldest Mesopotamian city civilization. A certain Dr. Badrinyaran, chief geologist of the team, also put forward the rather extreme unscientific theory that strong evidence supports the presence of humans from at least 31,000 BP, who were evolving and developing and formed a great hitherto unknown civilization that was submerged by the flood, giving credence to local and global flood myths. There has been considerable controversy over these discoveries and their dating. Critics noted that the team who found the ancient remains were geologists and not archaeologists, and therefore had no experience with investigating archaeological sites and dating archaeological material. The single early date of 7595 BC obtained from the remains comes from one single C14 dating. Normally, several C14 dates have to be obtained from objects from the same context to be certain of the date. Claims of the existence of these submerged city-like structures have also been disputed, with some archaeologists maintaining they are natural, not man-made. The same is true of the stone artifacts recovered from the site, which many researchers believe are merely natural stones or rocks. The pottery recovered, for example, is merely drenched-up casts of tube-worm tunnels from the ocean floor. At the University of Pennsylvania in the US, archaeologist Gregory Possell, who has excavated a number of Harappan sites in India, points out that there is no scientific reason to believe that the fossilized wood piece was dated back to 7500 BC and is linked to the ruins in the seabed. Taking into account the strong tidal movement in the area, it could easily have been swept from elsewhere. Other archaeologists don't think it possible that organic matter would have survived for thousands of years in the ocean, thus making it extremely unlikely that finds from the site would contain anything that could be carbon dated. Despite the claims of Hancock and the National Institute of Ocean Technology, nothing has been published from the site since its discovery in 2001. Neither have the artifacts from the site been made available to outside investigation. In fact, nothing at all has been heard of these supposedly amazing discoveries in the Gulf of Cambay for at least 10 years. Taking all of this into account, it does indeed seem that the story of a 9,000-year-old sunken city is just another wild claim made by dubious researchers and completely rejected by the legitimate archaeological community. A few years ago, newspapers all over the world carried the story that ancient history researcher Robert Sarmast has located the lost continent of Atlantis off the Mediterranean island of Cyprus. Sonar scanning apparently revealed man-made structures in the water around the island, 1 mile beneath sea level. Sarmast believed that the Mediterranean basin was flooded in 9000 BC, which submerged a rectangular landmass which he maintains was Atlantis. Although archaeologists at the time dismissed Sarmast's claims out of hand, new evidence suggests there may indeed be an ancient city submerged in the waters around Cyprus. Atlantis everywhere. Almost every year without fail, the headline "Atlantis Found" blares out from various newspapers all over the world. In fact, the range of hypothetical locations for Atlantis is staggering. The Minoan civilization of late Bronze Age Crete, supposedly destroyed by a colossal earthquake on the neighboring island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, around 1450 BC, was long thought to have been an indirect influence on Plato's Atlantis. However, research into late Bronze Age Crete has shown that the Minoan civilization continued to flourish long after the Theran quake. This vast array of wildly different theories has contributed to the skepticism of many researchers, who believe that Plato's Atlantis was merely a political allegory designed to glorify Athens as the perfect state fighting against a decadent and greedy Atlantean empire. For them, the story begins and ends with Plato. Solon never visited Egypt and heard the story from the priests at Sais. They reason that Plato located Atlantis out in the Atlantic beyond the Pillars of Hercules, because in his time this vast ocean represented the limit of the world known to the Greeks. Atlantis researchers, of course, would completely disagree with this conclusion. Indeed, one of them, Iranian-American architect Robert Sarmast, believes he knows exactly where Atlantis is. Did Robert Sarmast find Atlantis off Cyprus? Sarmast first hit the headlines in November 2004 when newspapers carried the story that after nearly 10 years of research using ocean mapping technology and accounts from ancient texts, he'd located Atlantis off Cyprus. Sarmast was quoted as saying, "This is going to rewrite the history books. We are set to make the biggest archaeological discovery of all time." He claimed that around 9000 BC, the Mediterranean basin was flooded in a deluge that submerged a rectangular, man-made site which he believed was Atlantis. The lost civilization apparently lay around 5,000 feet below sea level, 50 miles or so off the southeastern coast of Cyprus. Sarmast and his team had carried out deep-water sonar scanning, which indicated man-made structures on a submerged hill, including a wall almost 3 miles long, a walled hill summit, and deep trenches. Sarmast's 6-day expedition cost about $200,000 and was partly funded by the Cypriot Tourist Organization. Sarmast was quoted at the time as saying of his discoveries, "It is a miracle we found these walls, as their location and lengths match exactly the description of the Acropolis of Atlantis provided by Plato in his writings. We cannot yet provide tangible proof in the form of bricks and mortar, as the artifacts are still buried under several meters of sediment, but the circumstantial and other evidence is irrefutable. My discovery will vindicate Plato." Within his dialogues, Plato provides factual clues as to what Atlantis was like. I have matched all but 2 of the 45 clues with the area around Cyprus. That's either the biggest coincidence in the history of the world, or we have found Plato's Atlantis. Plato's account is so detailed that it is possible to make city plans based on his description. These match exactly the antediluvian maps of Cyprus as discovered through oceanographic mapping. Sarmas had in fact revealed his discoveries the year before he hit the newspaper headlines in a book entitled Discovery of Atlantis, The Startling Case for the Island of Cyprus. At a 2004 press conference to announce his discoveries, Sarmas was challenged by Michel Morisseau, a French geologist who lives on Cyprus, to provide evidence that the Mediterranean had been flooded far more recently than the conventionally accepted 5 million years. Unfortunately, Sarmas was not able to provide any evidence whatever to back up his claims. Despo Pilides, an archaeologist at the Department of Antiquities in Cyprus, said of Sarmas' claims, "The latest theory should be taken with a very large pinch of salt. Archaeologists only work with hard evidence. There is no evidence whatsoever to give credence to this hypothesis, and we have no intention of investigating it." Commenting on Sarmas' interpretation of the sonar results, Benny Pisa, a social anthropologist at Liverpool John Moores University in the UK, criticised his far-fetched theories and unscientific approach. Selective interpretation is nothing more than the blinkered reading of very ambiguous and unconvincing images, he said. Anyone with a critical eye can pick out these images that they're far too vague and uncertain to be regarded as compelling evidence for any man-made structures. The very foundation on which the hoax is based is completely bogus. According to his theory, Mr. Sarmas claims that the Mediterranean basin was flooded in a deluge at around 9000 BC, which submerged a rectangular landmass he believes was Atlantis. The problem is, there is no evidence whatsoever for any large-scale flooding of the Mediterranean basin at that time. Not to be deterred, Sarmas organized a second expedition to the site in 2006, but results of the work were inconclusive. He returned to Cyprus in June 2011 to film a documentary in support of his Atlantis theory. He again had the backing of the Cyprus Tourism Organization, as well as the History Channel, together with a number of private investors. However, Sarmas appears to have made no further discoveries at the supposed site of Atlantis, and nothing has been heard from him on the subject since 2013. New discoveries off Cyprus. However, the theory that ancient Atlantis may lie submerged in the waters off Cyprus does not seem to be dead yet. In April 2018, Cypriot newspaper The Cyprus Traveller announced that a chance discovery by a group of tourists had led a team of marine archaeologists to the location of Atlantis, off the coast of Paphos, a coastal city in southwest Cyprus. The team, led by archaeologist Marios Astio, used luge cutting-edge sonar technology to scan the ocean bed. After further surveillance, deep ground radar and digital mapping, a team was sent to the ocean floor where they discovered an ancient statue of Aphrodite. After extensive analysis, Professor Kostas Anotos from Cyprus University's Department of Antiquities authenticated the relic and confirmed that the extraordinary find was the first artifact that categorically proved that the great and wonderful empire of Atlantis was located off the coast of Paphos. A large-scale operation to recover further artifacts and building remains was soon underway, with the Cyprus Tourism Organization also planning to put out a tender for the building of a Paphos-based Atlantis museum. Marios Astio commented on the spectacular discoveries. Over the centuries, there's been heated debate over whether Atlantis was a mythical or historical location, with hundreds of archaeologists and geologists searching for its location. In fact, the reason I became a marine archaeologist was to try to discover the true location of Atlantis. Having completed my lifetime goal, I'm looking forward to enjoying an early retirement. He added, I was astounded when I heard that Astio and his team had discovered the location of the lost city of Atlantis, mainly because my great-grandmother always used to tell us Atlantis could be found at that exact spot in the ocean. No one listened to her, of course. It seemed the old bird was right. Marina Milona, a marketing and tourism officer at the Cyprus Tourism Organization, added, "It's been long rumored that the lost city of Atlantis was located just off the coast of Cyprus, and we're delighted that this has been officially confirmed." Researchers at an Irish university have claimed that they have found proof that Ireland is the lost land of Atlantis. They say that the astonishing Neolithic temple tomb at Newgrange in the Boyne Valley is, in fact, the famous Temple of Atlantis and one of the oldest temples on Earth as a result. The researchers state that Atlantis Island was devastated by a huge tsunami triggered by a comet that hit Earth over 11,000 years ago. Other scholars say that Atlantis was not Ireland itself, but lay just off the country's west coast, perhaps the land once known as High Brazil. What is the evidence to back up such extreme claims? The Great Temple Tomb of Newgrange. One of the greatest archaeological achievements of prehistory, the vast Neolithic tomb Temple of Newgrange, is one of the earliest roofed buildings in the world. Newgrange was probably built around 3200 BC and consists of a passage running for 62 feet and a 20-foot-high chamber with a corbelled roof, constructed of large stone slabs without mortar. The passage and chamber are covered by a huge stone and turf mound about 262 feet in diameter and around 44 feet high, surrounded at its base by 97 large stones known as curbstones, some of which are elaborately ornamented with megalithic art. For over 100 years, there has been speculation about who built Newgrange and what its primary function was. Excavations inside the chambers have revealed relatively few archaeological finds, probably because the majority had been removed in the centuries that the site remained open from 1699 until it was examined by archaeologist Professor Michael J. O'Reilly in 1962. The burials discovered consisted of 2 inhumations and at least 3 cremated bodies, all of which were found close to a huge stone basin, which seems to have been used for holding the bones of the dead. Archaeological finds inside the monument have not been spectacular, though a few gold objects have been found, including 2 gold torques, a piece of jewelry worn around the neck like a collar, a gold chain, 2 rings, a large phallus-like stone, a few pendants and beads, a bone chisel, and several bone pins. The lack of pottery finds at Newgrange is typical for passage grave cemeteries, which seem to have been places reserved for certain types of ritualistic activity involving a limited number of people. The entrance to the Newgrange passage tomb consists of a doorway composed of 2 standing stones and a horizontal lintel. Above the doorway is an aperture known as the roof box or light box. Every year, shortly after 9 a.m. on the morning of the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the sun begins its ascent across the Boyne Valley over a hill known locally as Red Mountain. The name possibly originates from the color of the sunrise on this day. The newly risen sun then sends a shaft of sunlight directly through the Newgrange light box, which penetrates down the passageway as a narrow beam of light, illuminating the central chamber at the back of the tomb. After just 17 minutes, the ray of light narrows and the chamber is once more left in darkness. This spectacular event was in fact not rediscovered until 1967 by Professor Michael J. O'Reilly, though it had been known about in local folklore before that time. In fact, the monument was known locally as the Cave of the Sun. The Newgrange lightbox reveals in spectacular fashion the knowledge of surveying and basic astronomy possessed by the Neolithic inhabitants of the area. It also illustrates that for the people who aligned their monument with the winter solstice, the sun must have formed an important part of their religious beliefs. But some researchers think that Newgrange was something else entirely, no less than a temple of Poseidon in ancient Atlantis as described by Plato. Ireland as Atlantis. According to Swedish scientist Ulf Erlingsson, the mythical sunken island of Atlantis was actually Ireland. He bases his claim on the geographical details described by Plato in his original account of Atlantis in 360 BC, linking it to the story of Dogger Bank, a shoal off the coast of England that was sunk by a tidal wave in 6000 BC. Erlingson described his theory in his 2004 book Atlantis from a Geographer's Perspective, Mapping the Fairyland. In January 2020, an organization calling itself Keystone University, which described itself as a new type of university that provides the best educational seminars on the planet, released a video on YouTube claiming that Ireland was ancient Atlantis. The organization claims on its website, Atlantis was a megalithic mother culture, an island in the Atlantic Ocean of seafaring people during the Stone Age. Our team have undertaken the largest ever investigation into the legend and have compiled overwhelming proof that the legend of Atlantis is loosely based on Stone Age Island. Our findings go completely against mainstream opinion and revolutionize human history. Our work will stand up to the highest levels of scrutiny, and we aim to have our work independently verified by impartial experts. Keystone University is not a real university. Its curriculum consists of brief seminars, 3 per year. One involves improving one's mental faculties, another concentrates on business skills, and the third is about ancient mysteries, including Atlantis and human evolution. Each 3-day seminar is available at the bargain cost of €1,000. There are numerous problems with identifying Ireland with Atlantis. The Irish myths and sagas linked to Newgrange and other megalithic monuments quoted by researchers in favor of the theory date to the early centuries AD, perhaps a few centuries earlier. Thus, they are many thousands of years later than the megalithic period and have no known connection with it. Plato wrote clearly that Atlantis was in front of the Pillars of Heracles. The entrance to the Strait of Gibraltar between Spain and Morocco, and Ireland is nowhere near there. Plato also said Atlantis was the size of Asia and Libya combined, while Ireland is many, many times smaller than this. But if Atlantis was not Ireland itself, could it have been located nearby? High Brazil is a mythical island that is said to have once existed and may still exist in the Atlantic Ocean off the west coast of Ireland. In fact, it was often shown on old maps as a very small island in that location. An island named Brasil was first shown on a Portolan chart by Majorcan cartographer Angelino Dulcert in 1325. Venetian cartographer Andrea Bianco placed an island named Insula de Brasil on a chart in 1436. So real was High Brazil thought to be that a number of expeditions were launched to try to find it, all without success. There is one intriguing mention by Italian explorer John Cabot, who wrote in a letter while at sea in the area of High Brazil that the land he was approaching was also discovered in the past by men from Bristol who found High Brazil. Even more strangely, in 1674, a Captain Nisbet not only claimed to have found the island while sailing from France to Ireland, but that he'd also met its inhabitants, a solitary magician in a castle and a race of huge black rabbits. What the truth of these strange assertions are, or what they were based on if anything, no one has ever been able to find out. Despite the lack of evidence, the Phantom Island continued to appear on maps until 1873, when it was shown for the last time on a British Admiralty chart. Because of its description and location, a number of researchers have linked High Brazil to Plato's Atlantis. According to Irish legend, High Brazil is a mysterious island forever blanketed in thick fog and invisible to the naked eye, only except for one day every 7 years when it is visible from the west of Ireland. As early as the 12th century, locals believed in the existence of a mysterious island that could be seen along the west coast of Ireland once every 7 years. There was an oral tradition of stories about an island in a fog bank or a floating island that would disappear when people approached it. According to Barry Cunliffe, professor of European archaeology at Oxford University, the story of High Brazil has a long history, predating its appearance on 14th century maps. The legend goes back much further, probably into pre-Christian times, appearing first in the 7th century in the Irish text known as the Adventure of Bran Sol Febal, which tells of Bran's visit to this other world island supported on pillars of gold where games are played, people are always happy, there is no sorrow or sickness, and music is always to be heard. Truly a land of the blessed. One or two researchers are of the opinion that the stories of Atlantis and High Brazil may have a common origin. They believe that both legends may be based on a common ancient source. A story was passed down through generations from the end of the last ice age when sea levels were much lower. Though that is an extraordinary length of time for a story to have survived, it's not completely beyond the realms of possibility. Some researchers believe that a map of Atlantis created in the 16th century shows Atlantis was in fact South America. They reason that if this was the case, the culture of the Aztecs, Maya, and other Central and South American cultures were directly influenced by the inhabitants of Atlantis. Other writers have suggested that gods from the East, sometimes seen as Atlanteans, arrived in remote times to influence the native culture of the area. When Columbus reached the Americas in 1492, people started to become aware that the world was a much bigger place than they'd ever imagined. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that prior to the late 15th century, there were no explorers, writers, or scientists advocating the existence of Atlantis. After Columbus, Atlantis began to be reborn in the popular consciousness, with some writers and researchers beginning to think that it may actually have been a real place. 17th century German Jesuit scholar Kircher published around 40 major works during his lifetime. In 1664, Kircher decided to create a map of Atlantis. Kircher's map places the south at the top of the map, possibly a reference to ancient Egyptian beliefs about cardinal directions or his own theories about water traveling through the center of the Earth from the South to North Pole. Kircher's map of Atlantis proved to some people that the Atlantis myth must have had a basis in reality. Where the shape of Kircher's Atlantis came from is somewhat of a mystery. Kircher himself stated that it was based on Egyptian maps and the writings of Plato, while other records claim that he found an ancient map in archives somewhere and copied it. Others allege that he borrowed the map's image from contemporary depictions of South America. It certainly matches closely Abraham Ortelius's map of South America published in 1592, though turned upside down. One of the results of the similarities of Kircher's map with that of the outline of South America was to influence some writers and researchers to look for traces of Atlantis in the Americas. Over the years, a number of researchers and authors have put forward the idea that Plato's mythical Atlantis was located in the Americas. They reason that the continent matches the vast proportions of the Atlantic island described in Plato's work, and that the ancient Greek author was somehow aware of its existence on the other side of the Western Ocean, perhaps through trader stories. Beginning in the 19th century, various writers proposed that the Toltecs and the Aztecs were members of the Nahuatl race, which originated in Atlantis. When Atlantis submerged in the Atlantic, they migrated to North America and eventually to the Valley of Mexico. The language that was spoken by the Aztec and Toltec peoples of Mexico has often been put forward as an explanation for the word Atlantis. Indeed, some researchers believe that the word Atlantis has an origin in that language. The word Atlan combines atl, meaning water, with tlan, which can mean into, under, or in. So Atlantan could mean in between the water or the water in between. According to 5th century BC Greek historian Herodotus, a Phoenician expedition circumnavigated Africa sometime between 610 and 595 BC. The ancient historian Didorius Siculus states that Phoenician ships traveled as far as the Canary Islands, Madeira, and the Azores. Perhaps a Phoenician expedition was blown off course by a severe storm, driving the ships as far as Central America. Could the Phoenician sailors have picked up the story of Atlantis from the inhabitants there and transferred it back to the Mediterranean? While this is a possibility, albeit rather remote, to date there is no archaeological evidence to confirm that Phoenicians, or any other ancient Mediterranean culture, ever crossed the Atlantic. One proposed location for Atlantis in the Americas is Tenochtitlan, the ancient capital of the Aztec Empire, located on the ancient site of Mexico City. An early description often called it the Atlantis of the ancient Aztec Empire. It certainly has hints of Plato's Atlantis. It was written by Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish conquistador, who participated as a soldier in the conquest of Mexico under Hernán Cortés. Part of his description of the great city reads, "When we saw so many cities and villages built in the water and other great towns on dry land, we were amazed and said that this was like the enchantments, on account of the great towers and quays and buildings rising from the water, and all built of masonry. And some of our soldiers even asked whether the things that we saw were not a dream. I do not know how to describe it. Seeing things as we did had never been heard or seen of before, not even dreamed about." In many ways, it was similar to Plato's Atlantis. The entire city was built on an island in what was then Lake Texcoco in the Valley of Mexico, and also possessed a complex series of canals that connected all the sections of the city. One legend connected with the foundation of the ancient city tells that it was populated by a group of Nahua tribes migrating from Aztlan, a place whose exact location remains a mystery, though many researchers have linked it with Atlantis. It's not just the Aztecs who've been an alleged Atlantis connection. In his 1973 book, Atlantis, Mother of Empires, author Robert B. Stacy Judd wrote that the Mayan civilization had arrived in Central America as the last significant surviving group of the fully developed Atlantean Empire from the Antilles. The Mayan books Chilambalam and Popol Vuh state that the first inhabitants of the Yucatan were the Chans coming from the east in 219 AD. The Spanish bishop Diego de Landra arrived in the Yucatan shortly after Cortés, and he said that the Maya told him that their ancestors had come from the east. Spanish writers of the 17th and 18th centuries concluded that the Olmecs had preceded the Toltecs and that they had come from the east, perhaps from Atlantis. In the mid-19th century, the Abbé de Brasbourg, a Catholic priest and journalist, apparently gained access to official records in Mexico City. From these records, he learned that Atlantis was the true cradle of civilization, disappearing in a cataclysm in 9937 BC. He believed that the culture and society of Atlantis was continued by the ancient Maya civilization and that there were extensive parallels between the Maya and Egyptian pantheons and cosmologies due to the fact that they had both had an origin on the lost continent of Atlantis. From perusing the archives, he put together a theory that the Atlantean continent had originally occupied the Gulf of Mexico, extending into the Caribbean Sea as far as the Canary Islands. It had been destroyed in several disastrous cataclysms between 9937 and 10,500 BC, though succeeding upheavals restored parts of the Yucatan, Honduras, and Guatemala. In his book published in 1862, he wrote that Atlantis, as described by Plato, had existed with a high level of civilization long before the beginning of civilizations in Europe and Asia. He also put forward the idea that the origins of European and Persian words could be traced back to indigenous languages of the Americas. He even suggested that Latin languages were derived of Quiche Maya, and the myth of Quetzalcoatl could be traced to Plato's Atlantis. Atlantis has not been the only civilization put forward as being a civilizing influence on ancient Central and South American cultures. In his 1961 book, A Quest of the White God, French-German diplomat Pierre Honoré explored the legends which persisted among the natives of Central and South America of pre-Columbian visitors, revered as gods that had come from the East. He concluded that the most important cultural and political influences on the Inca, Mayan, Aztec, and other pre-Columbian cultures were contributed by traders from the ancient Mediterranean world, most especially from Crete. According to Honoré, white-skinned Bronze Age Minoans interacted with Native Americans and brought a system of science and engineering, gave them their legal codes, and helped them achieve a high level of civilization. The Minoan culture on Crete was at its peak between 1700 and 1450 BC, with the great city of Knossos and the surrounding settlement having a population of perhaps as many as 100,000. There is no evidence that all the Minoans had any connection with peoples outside the Mediterranean, never mind across the Atlantic in Central America. Critics of Honoré's work correctly point out that it was racially insensitive and that the list of gifts bestowed on the Central and South American native populations was uncannily similar to that the French claimed to confer on the colonized peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, even as their empire was collapsing. According to authors James Churchward and Auguste Le Plongeon, the mythical lost Pacific continent of Lemuria, or Mu, extended from North Hawaii to the south as far as the Fijis and Easter Island, and also included Australia. Churchward claimed Mu was the site of the Garden of Eden and the home of 64 million inhabitants known as the Nakals. Its civilization flourished 50,000 years ago and was technologically more advanced than our own, and the ancient civilizations of India, Babylon, Persia, Egypt, and the Mayas were merely the decayed remnants of its colonies. Fascinatingly, some researchers claim that there are echoes of Churchward's submerged continent in Australia. Certainly, the idea of the lost continent of Lemuria had a significant influence among late 19th century, early 20th century Australian writers, with often bizarre results. Colonel James Churchward. James Churchward was born in Devon, southwest England in 1851. Throughout his life, he preferred to be known as Lieutenant Colonel, though it was never discovered where he served. His claims of knowledge of India and Tibet would suggest that it was in British India. By 1872, Churchward was serving in Sri Lanka and later borrowed money to finance a tea plantation there. In 1881, he was back in England, where he is listed in the census of that year as a tea planter living in Croydon, Surrey. Churchward moved to Brooklyn in the USA in the 1890s, where he later patented NCV steel, armor plating to protect ships during World War I. While in Brooklyn, Churchward became a close friend of British-American photographer and explorer Auguste Le Plongeon and his wife Alice. The Le Plongeons had traveled extensively in South America, photographing ancient sites, and were amongst the first people to photograph and study the Mayan city of Chichen Itza. Auguste Le Plongeon advocated the theory of the sunken lost city of Atlantis and its links with the Maya and the civilizations of ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, Auguste Le Plongeon's credibility was badly damaged by his attempted translation of a Mayan book known as the Troana Codex, also known as the Madrid Codex. In his books Sacred Mysteries Among the Mayans and Quiches, 1886, and Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx, 1896, Plongeon interpreted part of the text of the Troana Codex as revealing that the Maya of Yucatan were the ancestors of the Egyptians and many other civilizations. He also believed that an ancient continent, which he called Mu, had been destroyed by a volcanic eruption, the survivors of this cataclysm founding the Mayan civilization. Plongeon equates Mu with Atlantis and states that a Queen Mu, originally from Atlantis, traveled to Egypt, where she became known as Isis and founded the Egyptian civilization. However, Plongeon's interpretation of the Mayan book is considered by experts in Mayan archaeology and history as completely erroneous, indeed much of which he interpreted as hieroglyphics turned out to be ornamental design. Nevertheless, Le Plongeon's ideas were to have a profound influence on Churchward, and he began research looking into his own lost civilization. In the early 1930s, Churchward, now in his 70s, authored a series of books on the lost continent of Mu. His theory, expounded in these books, was that the now lost Pacific continent of Mu maintained an advanced level of civilization and colonies around the world. He also stated that Mu was the origin of the human race and that catastrophic events had eventually sunk Mu beneath the waves many thousands of years ago. One of the places Churchward included in his lost continent was Australia, Lemuria and Australia. Theosophy was an occult movement originating in the 19th century with roots that can be traced to ancient Gnosticism and Neoplatonism. The contemporary Theosophical movement came into being with the founding of the Theosophical Society in New York City in 1875 by Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, Henry Steele Olcott, and William Quan Judge. In her massive tome, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888, Blavatsky describes a history originating millions of years ago with the Lords of Flame, and goes on to discuss 5 root races which have existed on Earth, each one dying out in an earth-shattering cataclysm. The third of these root races she called the Lemurian, which lived 1 million years ago, and who were bizarre telepathic giants who kept dinosaurs as pets. The Lemurians eventually drowned when their continent was submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean. The progeny of the Lemurians was the 4th root race, the human Atlanteans, who were brought down by their use of black magic and their continent of Atlantis sinking beneath the waves 850,000 years ago. Present humanity represents the 5th root race. Blavatsky envisioned her gigantic land of Lemuria as covering a vast area. She also seems to have been the first writer to include Australia as part of the ancient lost continent. In her own words, Lemuria stretched from the foot of the Himalayas, which separated it from the inland sea rolling its waves over what is now Tibet, Mongolia, and the great desert Shambo, Gobi, from Chittagong westward to Hardwar and eastward to Assam. From thence, it stretched south across what is known to us as southern India, Ceylon and Sumatra, then embracing on its way as we go south Madagascar on its right hand and Australia and Tasmania on its left. It ran down to within a few degrees of the Antarctic Circle when, from Australia, an inland region on the mother continent in those ages, it extended far into the Pacific Ocean. Blavatsky's is the first occult interpretation of Lemuria, but on one level it should not be equated with the physical continent later proposed by Churchward. What Blavatsky and other occultists since have suggested concerning Lemuria could be partially interpreted as an ideal spiritual condition of the soul, a kind of spiritual historical vision. Nevertheless, there are some psychics and prophets who even today regard the existence of ancient Lemuria, Mu, as a physical reality. Indeed, there are a few, when hypnotically regressed, have recalled former lives as citizens on the doomed continent. The writings of Blavatsky and other theosophists about Lemuria and the idea of Australia is part of this ancient lost continent and the scene of a lost golden age had a significant influence on mystics and occultists in the country at the end of the 19th century. The earliest theosophical study group in Australia was set up in the late 1800s and called itself, perhaps unsurprisingly, Lemuria. Queensland-born novelist Rosa Campbell-Praed represented Australia as the last remnant of ancient Lemuria and believed the myth of the lost continent to be based on fact. In Praed's case, she used the theosophical idea of Lemuria to present an idealized primeval history of Australia, a land very different to the Queensland frontier country racked by racial violence she had witnessed firsthand as a child. Other evidence for this fascination with ancient Lemuria comes in a series of Australian adventures of the 1890s known as the Lemurian novels. In The Last Lemurian, written in 1898 by historian of Australian exploration and adventure romance novelist George Firth Scott, the narrator Dick Howard discovers the remains of legendary Lemuria out in the Australian desert, in a plot involving reincarnation, pygmies, a bunyip monster, and an occult yellow queen. John David Hennessy's An Australian Bush Track from 1896 calls Lemuria Zuzuland and locates it somewhere in North Queensland. Its inhabitants, the Zuzuans, are the remnant of a great nation who came there from some part of mainland of Asia, but had lost all the arts of high civilization they once possessed. The Lost Explorer from 1890 by James Francis Hogan has Lemuria as Malua, located in the centre of Australia and ruled by the cannibalistic queen Mokata, the last survivor of a superior race that once lived in the interior of the great southern continent. The idea that Australia was once part of this lost Eden has also influenced those of a more practical bent, and attempts have been made to locate traces of Lemurian civilization on both the west and east coasts of Australia. They reason that, if Lemuria had really existed, and the natural catastrophe that destroyed it actually took place, there should be at least some remains of this cataclysm in Australia and New Zealand. Following in the steps of Madame Blavatsky, Aboriginal art, artifacts and mythology have been used to identify the Aborigines as prehistoric remnants of the Lemurians who somehow escaped the devastation of 20,000 or so years ago. Some researchers believe Australian Aborigines have preserved knowledge of the original Lemurian disaster in their myths and folklore. However, the Aborigines of Australia had already been established on the continent for at least 30,000 years at the time of the supposed destruction of Lemuria. It's genuinely accepted that Australian Aboriginal peoples originally migrated from what is now Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia and the Philippines, and have been in Australia for at least 45,000 to 50,000 years. In fact, Australian Aboriginal peoples have perhaps the longest continuous cultural history of any people on Earth, so the theory of them having a Lemurian origin does not hold water. A mysterious carved pyramid, hidden, has been discovered amid the thick trees and bushes on the slopes of Mount Kazagi in north-central Japan. Local folk belief connects the structure with a giant white snake that is said to reside within it. Some researchers believe this strange pyramid and other unexplained ancient remains at Atami, southwest of Tokyo, are surviving testimony to an Atlantean civilization who traveled over the Earth in the remote past. Atlantis. The magical lost land of Atlantis has captured the imagination of poets, scholars, archaeologists, geologists, occultists and travelers for more than 2,000 years. The notion of a highly civilized advanced island civilization, which flourished in remote antiquity only to be destroyed overnight by a huge natural catastrophe, has inspired believers in the historical truth of the Atlantis tale to search practically every corner of the Earth for remnants of this once great civilization. Most archaeologists are of the opinion that the Atlantis story is just that, a story, an allegorical tale with no historical value whatsoever. And then there are the occultists, many of whom have approached the story of Atlantis from the standpoint that it represents either a lost spiritual homeland, like Mu, Lemuria, or a different plane of existence entirely. The original source from which all information about Atlantis ultimately derives is Greek philosopher Plato, in his two short dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written somewhere between 359 and 347 BC. Plato's supposed source for the story of Atlantis was a distant relative of his, a famous Athenian lawmaker and lyric poet called Solon. Solon had in turn heard the story on a visit to the court of Amasis, king of Egypt from 569 to 525 BC, in the city of Sais on the western edge of the Nile Delta. While at the court of Amasis, Solon visited the temple of Neith and fell into conversation with priests who related the story of Atlantis to him. The priest described a great island, larger than Libya and Asia combined, that had existed 9,000 years before their time beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis was ruled over by an alliance of kings descended from Poseidon, god of the sea and earthquakes, whose eldest son, Atlas, gave his name to the island and the surrounding ocean. The Atlanteans possessed an empire that stretched from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean as far as Egypt in the south and Italy in the north. During an attempt to extend their empire further into the Mediterranean, the Atlanteans came up against the combined powers of Europe led by Athens, in this remote period already a great city and a society ruled by a warrior elite who disdained riches and lived a Spartan lifestyle. The armies of Atlantis were eventually defeated by the Athenians alone after their allies had deserted them. However, soon after the victory, there was a devastating earthquake, followed by huge floods, and the continent of Atlantis sank beneath the ocean in a single dreadful day and night, in the words of Plato. Explorers have been searching for a real Atlantis for hundreds of years. A couple of recent discoveries have persuaded some researchers that the remains of the great civilization lie not in the Mediterranean, as one might reasonably suppose, but thousands of miles further east in Japan. Japanese pyramids. Mount Kasagi is a 1,950-foot-high mountain located in Kasagi town, in the southeastern part of the Kyoto prefecture. Their area is fairly remote, but is known for its Buddhist temple known as Kasagi-Dera Temple, which has a large image of the Buddha carved into the surface of a rock. Less known is an apparent pyramid in the foothills at the site. There isn't a lot of information available on the fairly small structure, but it has apparently been constructed from a single massive piece of granite, weighing approximately 9 tons. There are no markings anywhere on the pyramid or any indication as to who, if it is not merely a natural rock, fabricated it. One or two researchers have linked the structure with the pyramids of ancient Atlantis, believing it may be a relic left by Atlanteans who visited the area many thousands of years ago. There are no similar stones to be found anywhere around it, though there are reports of 4 other similar stone structures spaced 330 feet apart on the ridge of Mount Kasagi, 3 of them forming a triangular shape. One interesting fact concerning these pyramid-like stones is that the area is extremely rich in prehistoric rock art, which may indicate that it was seen as sacred in antiquity and was visited by some kind of ancient priesthood to perform rituals, possibly handed down from Atlantean refugees, were performed at the pyramid as well. In an ancient ritual annually performed at the site, an offering of eggs is left at the pyramid for the serpentine spirit of the place, a sacred snake said to dwell at the site. Myths concerning sacred snakes and offerings of eggs are unknown elsewhere in Japan, or indeed Asia. But there are similar myths from Egypt concerning the eternal serpent called Neph or Onuphis, On meaning sun, Ophis meaning serpent. Kneph was frequently depicted as a serpent thrusting an egg from its mouth, while Ra himself was often worshipped as the egg within the serpent's coil. Some researchers have equated the serpent powers of Neph with the Benten, the Japanese Buddhist goddess of Mount Kasagi. The myth of Bentlen calls her the Lady of the White Serpents and describes her arrival in Japan after traveling across East Asia sometime around 1300 years ago. Her shrine in Shirahama, located deep in the rock caves of Sandabeki, is associated with water and the unconscious. A further connection to ancient Egypt is suggested by some researchers in the similarity between the name Benten and the Egyptian Benben, an Egyptian bird of immortality, akin to a phoenix. The Benbe stone is an object found in the mythology of the country. This fabled stone is said to have once been kept in a shrine within the compounds of the temple dedicated to the deity Atum in Heliopolis. Coincidentally or not, when considering the Japanese pyramid connection, the Benben stone is also an architectural term given to the tip of an obelisk or the capstone placed on top of a pyramid. Atami Atlantis. Whilst there have been no more of these miniature Atlantean-type pyramids found so far in Japan, there are other connections with ancient Atlantis. One of them can be found in the area of the city of Atami, at the northeastern base of the Izu Peninsula, less than an hour west of Tokyo. The city actually occupies the crater of the extinct volcano Mount Atami. The surrounding hills are the remains of the crater wall, which has been drowned by the sea to the east. Atami's mild and warm climate, scenic seascape, and hot springs have made it a favored resort since the 5th century AD. Noting its position inside an extinct volcano almost half beneath the sea, and the name Atami, some researchers believe that the city may have had a connection with Atlantis in prehistoric times. However, although some writers have claimed that the word Atami has no meaning in the Japanese language, It in fact means hot ocean, a reference to the town's famous onsen hot springs. One or two have even posited that an ancient volcanic eruption of Mount Atami and the destruction of a prehistoric city on the site may have in fact been the origin of the Atlantis story. They posit that refugees from the fabled land were forced to leave Atami and relocate elsewhere in Japan, probably to the coast of the Japanese island of Yonaguni, where there are a series of mysterious rock formations which some believe to be the remains of Atlantean structures. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura believes the ruins of a city off the coast of Yonagami Island on the southwestern tip of Japan could even be the lost land of Atlantis, or even Mu, a Pacific equivalent of the tale of the lost city of Atlantis. Kimura, a professor at Ryukyu University and the chairman of the non-profit Marine Science and Culture Heritage Research Association, said, "Judging by the design and the disposition of the ruins, the city must have looked just like an ancient Roman city. I can envisage a triumphal arch-like statue stood on the left of the Colosseum and a shrine over the hill." Kimura believes the submerged city had a castle, a shrine, an arch, statues, and a Colosseum. He said, "In my estimation, the castle was situated right in the middle of the city, and though not as big as the castle and a lot of ruins, Kimura believes the city was sunk in an earthquake 3,000 years ago." Perhaps unsurprisingly, many scientists dismiss this claim, saying the ruins can be explained by natural phenomena such as tidal or volcanic activity. Perhaps the most significant objection to Kimura's theory, however, is that no ancient artifacts such as clay pots or weapons have ever been found in the vicinity of the rock formation to prove that humans had once been present there. Kimura, however, remains positive and determined to prove his theory, saying, "I'm getting close to a conviction that this is a mysterious civilization lost in a tectonic deformation in the Pacific Ocean."